So there's two individuals getting mic'd up right now. Born and raised in Sault Ste. Marie, Conor Mihell's family has rooted in that community for about 190 years, where he says the Sioux and Lake Superior are embedded in my persona. Conor's first canoe trip memory was from the age of 12 when his dad wanted to show him the Goulet River, a rapid-laden route. They rented from a local man who had made a homemade fiberglass chopper, strand style, and a paddle broke halfway on trip, and they joked that a broken goalie stick would have worked much better. He distinctly remembers when they brought the canoe back that the guy they had rented the canoe from was slaughtering chickens in the backyard. Conor's paddling continues, and he continues to canoe and kayak, leading commercial trips for outfitters in his local watershed regions. Each summer, he trips about 400 to 500 kilometers, representing about half the North Shore. And 3 years ago, Conor discovered the Little North, and last summer, it was northern Quebec, and his next trip is Nastapoka River that flows into Hudson's Bay north of Richmond Gulf on the eastern shore in Herb Pole country. It'll come as no surprise then that to Conor, canoeing is freedom. Conor's also published in The Walrus, which is a really amazing literature, and he has a book here on this table as well. He will be co-presenting with Ginny Marshall. Many of you will know Ginny in her role as the editor of Venture Kayak and as a past editor of Canoe Routes. Ginny Marshall will be joining Conor on the Nastapoka trip this summer. She describes her first trip there as a bit of an eye-opener and is really looking forward to going back. One of her biggest dreams is to see the wildlife in the territories. As she describes it, that's my someday dream. This is a far cry from her young life canoe journeys, which, she told me, always included some sort of desperate food debacle, things falling in the food, losing a pack, what have you. And although her parents were more car campers and were relatively ill-equipped, it did not deter her. Rather, it ignited an interest in the paddling world. As she said, you don't have to nail it the first try, and I don't think any of us ever do. She's been paddling over a decade, but the Great Whale trip was her first month-long trip and was her first time in the North. To her, canoeing helps you see your country in a whole new and really great way. Together, Conor and Ginny will be sharing the Great Whale trip experiences in northern Quebec. Both expressed how mind-boggling that space and place was, that newness, the dramatic difference from other regions. As Conor described it, everything was on a really raw scale. Please help me welcome Conor and Ginny.
Thanks so much, Erica, and thank you so much to Alex and George and Roger and everyone who puts this together. I think I speak for everyone when I say that the organization that must go into this, it goes beyond any canoe trip plan you could ever put together or any presentation you could throw together to deliver up here. So congratulations on 30 years. It's an honor to be here for that reason.
Absolutely.
So today, Ginny and I are going to tell you a story about the canoe trip we did last summer. And we are going to tell it through the perspective of photographs that we took on the trip, kind of telling stories through these photos. And first off, I think it's neat to give you some background on how the trip came together. So there's 4 of us, but originally it started with 2 of us, a fellow by the name of Ryan and myself. And he was a teacher in Blind River in the North Shore of Lake Huron. And we had talked about doing a trip together for a while. He's a pretty well-traveled guy, seemed like a great person to trip with. My wife, Kim, she had decided that she was going to take the summer off. She had just finished teacher's college. She was kind of switching careers and hoping to find work. And she was in Thunder Bay last winter going to school, and I was at home with the dog and kind of telling her about this trip that we were planning to do. And every time we spoke, I would tell her a little bit more, and the maps were coming, and I was looking at Google Earth, and I was seeing this great river trip that was kind of piecing together in my mind's eye, and I could tell it was coming together in hers as well. And sure enough, right around this time of year last year, She said, I'm coming. I don't care about work. I'm going to come on the trip. So all of a sudden, we were scrambling. So lo and behold, Ginny stepped in pretty quickly, eh?
Yeah, it didn't take much convincing, that's for sure.
So we planned a trip in northern Quebec, and one of the reasons why I wanted to go there was kind of the prompting of a friend of mine in Quebec City, and it's too bad he can't be here today. He's a real student of the wilderness and student of the past and historical journeys, and he said, Conor, you got to go to the Great Whale River, Lac Bienville. There's this great route. Camp Kuwaitin has done it, and through another friend, I managed to reach out to Camp Kuwaitin and pick up some information, and we put together this trip that way. And I think for me, I was reading yesterday on the flight here, something that really resonated with me, trying to figure out how to introduce this talk today. And it was this idea that human beings evolved from the savanna landscape of Africa. And if you think about it, the savanna is very much what we have kind of in that transition zone between the boreal forest and the tundra. It's open. The grasses are kind of replaced with lichen. Interspersed with copses of trees. There's lots of water, plenty of birds, animals, all kinds of greenery, and often rivers, lakes, and water. I was reading in the story yesterday, and it said, even when people do not have this landscape, they consider it beautiful when viewed as art. And I found it interesting, reflecting on some of the presentations that I've seen today and last night, that so many of the photographs that we've seen today have represented that open landscape that I think humans are intrinsically drawn to. And you're going to see a lot of that today, so I hope you enjoy it. A little bit about the route really quickly. I really don't like using Google Earth for these types of things, but it kind of picks it all together. So we start at Lac des Oeufs, Egg Lake, which is at the end of the Trans-Taiga Highway pretty much, kind of an offshoot of that. We started on the Penobscot River and made our way over to the Great Whale. And then the genius of our route was the notes that we had from Camp Kuwaitin. And they traveled across country to the Coates River, which is a more intimate, it's a smaller waterway, and rejoins the Great Whale close to Hudson Bay, and we finished on the coast at the town of Kuujjuarapik.
So our capable and charming Quebecois shuttle driver for the Trans-Taiga Highway was this gentleman, Yves, and he was the absolute best chaperone you could hope for such a drive. As well as being handy with a tire iron, Yves was something of a Renaissance man. He'd come to Radisson by way of crewing on boats and working on farms in Florida, the Bahamas, New Zealand. He seemed to have been everywhere. And so when our trailer tires shredded apart around the halfway mark on this, 600, 700 kilometer road, gravel road, made us feel pretty vulnerable, for sure. Yves was out of the truck. He had the spare on almost before I could snap this photo. It was great, really reassuring.
Yeah, for me, this photo really speaks to the expansiveness of the landscape and the sense of smallness that you have, and also the sense of vulnerability you have when you're relying on technology to get you somewhere. It wasn't just an airplane flying us in. It was this huge Ford F-450 or something pickup truck and this junky old trailer that I borrowed from a friend. And this is what we're relying on to get us to this canoe trip that we spent months planning. And it was a humbling experience, and I think it was a really good introduction to the landscape for us. This was where we started. So for me, this photo embodies freedom, and it's freedom for both me as a paddler, and it's something that I've kind of revolved my life around, trying to make as much time to explore and to travel as I can, but also the freedom for rivers. So this is the very northwest end of the James Bay Hydro Complex. So looking in the direction that we're looking with this photo, rivers run free. Behind me is harnessed water feeding into the La Grande River, into some of the largest hydroelectric facilities in the world. So it was a real pivotal moment for us on the trip. It was the very first campsite, kind of on the side of a gravel road, but also it was a kind of the symbolism of getting onto this free-flowing river and a landscape that's just larger than life in terms of the flowing water on it.
And just to add to making the experience a little more surreal for me, So we got there at dusk when Conor snapped this photo. The next morning, my canoe partner Ryan pulls out his shotgun and says, "Now it's time to practice. You guys each know how to use this in case we meet a polar bear." So there's Conor and I, who've never handled a gun before, sort of taking aim literally at Hydro-Quebec and firing this shotgun into this gravel dam. Certainly an interesting way to start a canoe trip.
We won't be bringing the gun next year, or this year.
So unpredictable weather was one of the first challenges of the trip. It actually felt like two separate trips. We had 3 weeks of cool and wet, followed by 1 week of hot and sunny. As a first-timer, me in the north, by day 10 I'd convinced myself that it never stops raining and campsites are soggy, and that's just the north. And reports to the contrary must be fabrications or just lucky exceptions, you know. So, but I like watching the weather and making my own predictions. This region of Nunavut had us completely mystified, and eventually we realized, watching the sky, hey, the weather systems are actually approaching from the east, which turned everything I thought I knew about Canadian weather on its head.
It was interesting weather, though, because every evening, it felt like just about every evening, we'd have this moment of respite when the rain would stop, we'd have our bellies full, sometimes the sun would shine. This is actually forest fire-laden skies blowing across Hudson Bay, I suppose, because there sure as hell weren't any forest fires in Quebec last summer with all the rain we had. But the bugs would go away, and we could just kind of sit around and chat around the fire, tell stories, look at the maps, read, write in our journals, all those wonderful things that we come to enjoy on canoe trips. And for me, the way I relate to the natural world comes a lot from my grandfather, and he lived on Lake Superior and spent many a good evening there with him, and one of the things he would say is, "I wonder what the rich people of the world are doing right now." And now I kind of realize what he meant, and he meant that we're very rich people to have this type of experience.
So the quiet and immensity of that landscape really gave you the space and time for contemplation, and some of my favorite times on the trip were the early mornings when my turn at breakfast duty would have me up before everyone else, before even the sun. And occasionally breakfast would be a little delayed when I was, you know, distracted by a glorious sunrise or fog rising on the river or dew-jeweled spider webs and spruce boughs. But Erica's wonderful introduction notwithstanding, most of my meals, I think Conor can vouch for this, were completely edible. Even if they were a little delayed sometimes. So.
Ginny likes chocolate, and she likes cheesecake, so she can come on any trip as long as she brings that in abundance. So one of the things that we talked about in those great evenings around the fire, we do a lot of reading. Everyone on the trip are avid readers. And actually, I came upon this the other day. Sorry, it wasn't discussed on the trip, although the book was Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And a wonderful pithy quote coming from that book. "Physical discomfort is important only when the mood is wrong. Then you fasten on to whatever thing is uncomfortable and call that the cause. But if the mood is right, physical discomfort doesn't mean much."
And it's as true on a canoe trip as it is on a motorcycle seat in a rainstorm.
So here we are, we're crossing over to the Great Whale River. Generally we had lots of water last summer, but for some reason there wasn't much here. 200 yards of this. Ryan always carried the Wanigan, God bless him for that. And I almost lost my nerve on this portage. I don't lose my nerve very often when it comes to physical challenges, but carrying a 100-pound waterlogged wood canvas canoe over slippery rocks set in a sea of muck just about caused me to lose it. But I made it. The mood was right afterwards. And it kind of speaks to this thing about canoe trips. It's so wonderful. And that's, it can be hell when you're out there in the moment, but when you think back, all those hellish ordeals kind of filter through like flour going through a sifting machine, and all we remember are those utopic memories in between.
I think you called it the way misery transforms by memory.
That's it. Is that what I wrote? You want back?
Oh, well, just a comment I'd add. My background is largely as a sea kyer, and it's ironic that the portages were actually sort of one of the most familiar experiences for me on this trip. Not that you portage sea kayaks a lot, but just that in some cases they were physically impassable when they were wet. Just the footing wasn't there, so that waiting for the weather was, you know, as true on a landlocked canoe trip as it is on the open coast. Swatting black flies, checking coordinates. This photo pretty much sums up that long, overgrown portage, familiar to many of you, I'm sure, where every map check makes you a stationary buffet for bloodthirsty bugs. The experience of following a bearing through untracked spruce swamp for hundreds of meters was new to me, but both Conor and I loved working with maps. On this 800-meter portage on day 3, we were pretty sure of our position, but we hadn't really gained the confidence yet to trust that instinct. So fortunately, Ryan had a very rudimentary GPS device for those situations. And being map geeks, Conor and I naturally started calling him the man who talks to the stars.
Yeah, you talk about the contrast between sea kayaking and canoeing. It's something that came through to me, because I started as a canoeist. That's kind of how I got into the wilderness, but I quickly moved towards sea kayaking. Being on the Great Lakes, it made sense. If I wanted to work my summers as a student, I could paddle a sea kayak more than I could paddle a canoe. But the real contrast is this image. You'd never see this in a sea kayak magazine, would you, Ginny?
Probably not.
So part of the reason I wanted to go to Quebec, based on, well, first off, what Etienne had told me, and also I love traveling in places where we can see vestiges of past cultures. Some of them are older than others. Northern Quebec really captured my imagination. A film that my dad loved, he was an English teacher, he loved to show his students, was Cree Hunters of Mistassini. I often wonder how he found that, or why. I know why he enjoyed showing it to them, the same reason why I love watching it, but I wonder how he found it. Ginny was lucky today in the book sale. She found Strangers Devour the Land by Boyce Richardson, who's the fellow who produced that film for the National Film Board. We came across a few Cree camps on the land, spots where there's still some hunting going on and trapping and so on. But times have really changed. So instead of canoeing into these camps, typically I think they're arriving by aircraft or they're coming in by snow machine. And as neat as it was to encounter these locations, it was more interesting for me to see the land in between them. And it made me remember something from Boyce Richardson's writing, a quote from Sam Blacksmith, who was one of the main characters in Cree Hunters of Mistassini. He was a trapper, a hunter. And he said this: "We are told that we own the land, but really nobody can own the land, for eventually everyone dies." When you're out there and you're seeing these remains, you realize just how relevant and how true that statement is.
So as Conor was pointing out, we were just the most recent travelers in a long tradition on this land. And the mossy medallion of rocks that you see in the lower left there on this scenic island was the remains of a central fire hearth around which a Cree teepee would have stood. We had no way of knowing how old it was, but it was a subtle yet powerful reminder that people have been drawn to the same beauty spots for centuries.
So I really love doing canoe trips with my wife, and it's too bad she can't be here to watch this. She's from Newfoundland, actually, and I know she would have enjoyed Kevin's presentation a whole lot. But we've been paddling together for about 10 years now, and every trip I do with Kim, I learn something new. And the early trips revolved around whitewater paddling and that type of thing, learning how to read a river together and kind of dance with the river together in our canoe. But on this trip, we were doing something that was relatively new for us. But a friend of ours, Hugh Stewart, who built the canoe that we used, he likes to say that it's not a real canoe trip unless you go upstream. And we've become lazy. We fly into headwaters. We choose routes that only lead us downriver. And on this trip, we were lucky to go upstream and to learn about some of these old skills that really get us into these places. And they enable long-distance trips in an age where time is of short supply for a lot of people. So just wading and lining and obviously a lot of portaging, which we're familiar with, it was just a way to open up the landscape and to really get a sense of reward.
So Quebecers have a saying, traiter aux petits oignons. It means to treat with great care, or literally to be treated with little onions. Conor and Kim paddled a traditional cedar canvas canoe on this trip, while Ryan and I piloted a battered Royal X boat from 1989. So for me, it was really interesting to see the difference in approach that goes with those two different styles. For Conor, it wasn't enough to just drag the boat ashore and get it on his shoulders, or at the end of a long, grueling portage to just throw it down wherever he could manage. He had to handle it delicately. Traiter aux petits oignons. Sometimes, in fact, Kim and I would have to stand at the bow and stern and act as like spotters while he sort of tottered along a particularly treacherous boulder garden. And at every transition point, the canoe had to be floated in deep water for loading and unloading. So by comparison, Ryan and I had it easy. We could load it on a rock ledge and slide it right into the river. But nothing, I think you'll agree, nothing beats the aesthetic of a cedar canvas canoe in its element.
It hangs in my garage, and just about every day of the week I go out there and I look at it. I want to put it in the living room, but I don't think there's enough space. So we were so lucky. The canoeing community is fantastic. This winter I've been planning this trip on the Nastapoka and talking to a fellow who many of you would probably know, Dave Brown from Vermont. He organizes a symposium just like this down there. And but for this trip, for the Coats, we were getting our information from Camp Kuwaitan. And so generous people just sent me trip reports and all kinds of information, giving us a good sense of what to expect, and really pointing us in the direction of this beautiful river called the Coats, which is unremarkable on a black and white map. It's kind of tucked in between the Little Whale River and the Great Whale River, yet it was kind of the ideal gradient for a canoe trip, runnable rapids, portages, waterfalls, lakes, just a beautiful waterway that we returned to thanks to the folks at Camp Kuwaitan.
Conor insisted that I tell the funny backstory that goes along with this photo, even though it's somewhat embarrassing for those involved. So the top of this rapid, Conor and Kim eddied out very gracefully. It wasn't a hairy eddy line. It wasn't really anything. And Ryan and I sort of, charged in after them. And I feel the canoe sort of wobble. I'm in the bow. And I look behind me, and there's nobody there. And there's sort of water sloshing over the side, and Ryan pops up in the water nearby, and I jumped out to save the boat. Okay, so I'm charging, just sort of, well, you're on your own, son. All these rapids are below us, and I just start charging and see Conor sort of deer in headlights, grabbing for the throw bag in the eddy. But luckily, we both sort of had washed into the eddy. We just got hung up on the eddy line. So that was a fun little eye-opener for both of us. I think pay attention, even on small features, just be present and always pay attention. Ryan and my beater boat, combined with my naive optimism, often meant that we served as the probe on shallow rapids and pinball boulder runs. And if we could make it through without scrubbing, then Conor and Kim's higher floating canoe would certainly run through unscathed. Our roles reversed on high volume rapids and deep hits like this one on the lower Coats, where our heavily laden tripper and past experience put us at greater risk of swamping. Yeah, so Conor and Kim, they seemed to be able to put the canoe right where they wanted it. Ryan and I had that close call, and we did have one fairly ignominious swim that I'm not going to tell you about. But fortunately, Conor witnessed the whole thing, and insisted on giving us a detailed play-by-play of that several times afterwards and on successive campfires. So
They almost ran it backwards.
we almost made it backwards.
So this is one of my favorite campsites of the trip. Land of Eskers, northern Quebec. Make beautiful spots to camp. Very aesthetically pleasing. You look at that curve of that gravel ancient stream bed, and it's beautiful to look at. Before we did the trip, I had the pleasure of reading a book by Arthur Twomey, Needle to the North. Some of you may have heard of his work. He traveled in the area in 1938, probably one of the first non-native people to explore the area. He was looking for freshwater seals, trying to identify unique species of freshwater seal around Clearwater Lake. Anyways, he went in the winter, and he justified this in the following way. Why didn't we go in the summertime? It would, of course, have been quite possible to go inland on a summer expedition, but less easily, perhaps, than you would imagine. Like a saturated sponge, the land yields water at a touch. There are lakes, swamps, and rivers in every summer valley. There are bare rocks, waterfalls, and lichens on the hills. I read that, and I look at this place, and I remember this place. I think, why the hell didn't he go in the summertime instead of freezing to death in the winter?
This site is on the Coates River. It was one of my favorite camps. We called it Big Crack Camp for that thunderbolt-shaped fissure zigzagging through the rock plateau. Some might see that as a hazard, or at the very least an inconvenience. We had to leap across this meter-wide, water-filled abyss to move between the boats, the kitchen, and the tents. But I felt a strange connection to that place and affection for it. And at times, I thought I heard whispering from the cracks. It could have just been the sound of distant rapids throwing their murmurings. Or maybe what I was hearing was the mischievous Ojibwa rock spirits, Mamagwashi. Campsites are some of the few places we stop and remain for a few hours or a few days. They're the rich intermission on the scrolling film of a river journey.
So at this spot, Ginny came up with this great idea. We got there, it was pretty cold and miserable and raining, as usual. And Ginny had this great idea. We're going to do the first annual Coates River Naked Crack Swim. But
Nobody took me up on it.
You didn't do it either.
I didn't do it either.
So I spend a lot of time traveling in the summer. I'm guiding a lot. I probably out 100 or so days of the year camping. But it never fails to really surprise me at how quickly we get into a rhythm when we're on the land. And it's such a simple rhythm, it's such a pleasant rhythm, and it's such a way of life that I think a lot of people need to recapture in the way they live today. You wake up, you have breakfast, you paddle, you have lunch, you paddle, you camp, you do it again. And it's just such a nice thing to be able to do that and travel in the land in that manner.
This trip was my first experience cooking exclusively with wood. I now consider myself a recovering white gas devotee. What I really enjoyed about a wood-fueled camp kitchen, besides not having to portage 4 weeks' worth of white gas, was the social and cooperative atmosphere. So often when you're cooking on a gas stove, it's noisy and it's isolating for the chef. When you're cooking with wood, the group participates in gathering kindling, felling, bucking, and splitting the wood. And the flame is silent, so it doesn't disrupt conversation, and the kitchen becomes a natural gathering place, which is really cool.
So this was getting near the payoff of the trip, kind of the climax of the trip. As the rivers get close to Hudson Bay, they start falling, and they fall with a lot of power. And we started seeing signs of Hydro-Quebec. In the early 90s, they had explored this area, cataloging all the falling water. And writing stuff like this. Objectively, unemotionally, one can state that the development of James Bay will set Quebec on a new road to progress. It is an undertaking which once again will furnish tangible proof of Quebec's vitality and spirit of enterprise. For the development of James Bay is the most daring project in Quebec's history. James Bay is the land of tomorrow. I found it ironic that the French people, the French language has such a evocative and beautiful term for moving water. L'eau vive says living water. It speaks of a kinesthetic element to moving water that I think as paddlers we can all relate to. And yet there's such a compulsion to turn that l'eau vive into l'eau morte, or dead water, where its only value is its potential energy as opposed to that constantly flowing kinetic energy that we really love as paddlers.
So ideally there comes a time on every long trip where you've banked a few rest days and you can slow down and explore a bit more along the way. Here we're climbing a sparsely treed summit beside the Coates River, and it was really interesting to get that sort of aerial perspective of the waterway. It was, from up here you could see how the river had found its course, picking its way through the path of least resistance. And I was amazed at how climbing even a modest height in the taiga yields just such a dramatically different view of the landscape than from river level.
So we knew that this day was coming. This is the big falls on the Great Whale River. The river makes a right angle bend and falls about 100 feet. Massive waterfall, the scale of Niagara Falls. We could hear it the night before, 20 kilometers away in camp. Distinct rumbling. Where I live in Sault Ste. Marie, I've heard stories about people saying the falls of the St. Mary's River, you could hear them from that far away, and this river dwarfs the St. Mary's. Of course, it comes with a long portage, about 2.5 miles worth of first alder schnarb, and then a series of ridges, sandy ridges, kind of linking together. And we learned a lot on this portage, I think, didn't we, Ginny? The first one being, in open country, forget about the compass, follow the high land. The second thing being, a friend of mine likes to say this about backcountry skiing, stick to the ridges, because once you're in a valley, you have no options. And the third thing being, which Ryan learned pretty damn quickly, was that carry the canoe on the second load when you're going on a long, unknown portage. He wasn't smiling by the end of it. In fact, Ginny had the canoe.
So how many of you have that hero shot? The one all your friends and family get to see when you get home? Maybe you're sitting naked on top of a boulder waving a Canadian flag. This is my hero shot from that, later in that portage. We're about 2 kilometers across on that first trip. I've got the canoe at this point. And we've run up to the edge of this mountain. And our destination is the rock point that you can see below my bow. Our challenge is, how do we get down there? For me, this was one of the most strenuous, but also one of the most memorable and rewarding parts of the trip. We had those Keewaydin trip notes that Conor mentioned from a trip a decade earlier, but on a long, complex portage like this one, those notes aren't really a lot of use. And this is where real adventure and problem solving happens, when you're off the notes, if not off the maps. So this is the view upriver from our camp at the end of that portage. The mountain we picked our way down is on the left, and the first of the next day's rapids is on our doorstep. With the searing heat of that day finally abating and that monumental obstacle behind us, for me, the hours following that portage were a time of relief and satisfaction in what we had accomplished. I knew the rapids the next day would be the largest and most challenging that we'd faced so far, but that knowledge was abstract in the way only a first-timers can be. Conor had a very different perspective.
This place was terrifying. You could hear boulders bouncing down the riverbed, belching. It's like a giant. It's like tiptoeing on the back of a dragon. It's one of those places, we all have them. We've all been to places like this where you're terrified of what's coming up next, what's going to happen the next day. And this was at sunset, just before I went in the tent tonight. It was a warm day. I felt compelled to go back in the river for a swim in that eddy, and you could just feel the power of the river. And I knew what was coming up the next day would be the crux of the trip and kind of what we'd been basically practicing for over the past 3 weeks. This is my attempt at Hap Wilson. The water was big enough that we weren't bothering to take pictures. 6 kilometers of class 3, 4, 5 holes that would swallow Greyhound buses. Massive stuff. We were just tiptoeing down the edge of the river. The shoreline was pretty much impenetrable. Lining, carrying over slippery rocks. Luckily, we had a beautiful day. And then by the time we got to the end, just the best whitewater you could ever imagine. I live for days like this.
Luckily, you can't read all of Conor's rapid names on there, but we got quite creative. There was a portage called Twinkle Toes, and a long stretch of whitewater that we walked on the shore that Conor called Doing Lines, and a couple other interesting names as well.
Nice names.
Yeah. At the Blue Mountain Scenic Caves in Collingwood, there's a narrow gap called Fat Man's Misery. We gave this spot on the Big Bend Gorge the same name, and the canoe just barely squeezed behind this boulder that had broken away from the cliff shoreline.
This was the last portage of the gorge.
Last photo, I promise. The last image that I'd like to share with you tonight is this one that Conor captured on our final day on the river. And to me, it really encapsulates all of the incredible emotions and learning of my first wilderness river trip. On the faces of the paddlers, I see happiness, pride, and relief. Ryan and I had never paddled together before this trip, 4-week trip. We'd never even met before this trip. And each challenge brought a learning curve in that relationship, sometimes a steep one. And after the harrowing whitewater of that Big Bend Gorge, we were surprised by one last large rapid. And we had no choice but to make a long, high-risk ferry across to the far shore to avoid a series of unrunnable ledges. Conor and Kim went first. The waves looked enormous. Ryan and I made a plan, gave ourselves a pep talk, dug in, and skillfully rode across the roller coaster to the eddy where Conor was waiting for carnage, I think, with his camera in hand. This is the photo he got. I think he was disappointed. And this is pretty much the exact moment that it all came together for us in the last rapids and on the last day of the trip.
So there's our group. Don't really have much to say after what Ginny just said, other than the fact that we did the trip together. And it's something we can be proud of, and we're happy that we had the chance to tell you about it today. Thank you.
Thank you.